On Romanticism, Rousseau, Sade, and the Resurrection of the Mother Colossus, by Andrushka Laro, read for you by Alan Rickman. All mythology commences at cosmogony, the forging of nature from totalizing origins. Man and his grand chronicle has generally fathomed two orders of genesis. For the pagan, or polytheistic, he confines everything absolute and sovereign exclusively to nature and all her moulding forms. But for the Judeo-Christian, or monotheistic, the absolute and sovereign is exclusively confined to the heavens, to Logos. All cosmogonies are thus divided in terms of either being earth cults or sky cults. For the pagan, man comes forth from nature and her eternal flux. Man is a product of the mother's seed and substance. There is no decision or independence from her, no division or severance. What primitive man first realized in the drama of forms and processes, what vexed and terrified him beyond all imagination, was the inextricable link between mother and matter. The etymology is no coincidence. The genesis of all life springs forth from the female colossus. Her rhythms and cycles are the rhythms and cycles of nature, Mother Nature. Earth cult is the cult of mother. She births and devours all. Woman, being simultaneous to nature, was universal. It was the de facto presuppositional default of the pagan thought process. What transcended this mentality was the Western ethic, the transcendence of nature to Logos. We find proof on this in tragedy. Tragedy is almost exclusively Western. It is a mass-scale response mechanism to pagan cosmogony, an endeavor to become fully independent from the mother cult, which was the essence of primitive consciousness. She is the bane of the Western masculine persona, of his freedom, but the venue of all his dependencies. The mistreatment of women in Western tragedy emerges from nature's mistreatment of man. Much of Western women of tragedy exemplifies this deathless will, this immortal spirit to escape the all-encompassing, all-enthralling inevitability of matter, of pagan mother cult. From Euripides' Medea and Phaedra to Shakespeare's Cleopatra and Lady Macbeth, the hovering theme ensouled in man is an avoidance complex and the conquering of his male identity, the need to become independent from the ever-so-engulfing inevitability of matter, of Mother Nature. Feminine men are the antithesis of Western tragedy, but the glittering ornaments of Greek pagan lore. For men in these Western scenes are always valiant, brave, vanquishing. Women, on the other hand, always less moral than their counterparts, less heroic, less wanton and willed at every moment. Their actions are questionable to underworldly. We need not recount the tales of Lilith, the fables of the Harpies, Sirens, or the Sphinx. Clytemnestra, who, like the maidens of Lemnos, murdered her husband. Athena, the murderess of her son, and Scylla, that of her father. In the lines of Aeschylus, the fatal women shine with all the dark splendor of comets, for she has always been fatal in Western tragedy. She has always been nature. Medusa, with the vines of the earth as serpents in her hair, never turns women into victims. She feeds the Western male spirit by having exclusively male prey. It is an organic cycle, for we all come from female origins, from the jellies of the watery amnion, from the belly of liquid nature. The impulse has always been into self-identity. It was Oedipus who tried with all might to escape his mother, only to find himself back into her arms. The birth of Western tragedy is the birth of the determined masculine soul to escape the pagan consciousness, to finally defeat and transcend Mother Nature. Western tragedy, thus, is the fuel by which man reclaims his independence from the unrelenting womb of the feminine earth, from the black gullet that has spat him forth and would digest him anew. For we are all born female. The transition from earth cult to sky cult, from pagan to Jew, is the transition between man's indecipherable dependence on nature to his realized independence from nature. From birth, the male impulse has always been to escape the mother into self-identity. The female doesn't need to become, because she already is. The Book of Genesis marks the first step at this Western process, at man's absolute freedom from the overwhelming oblivion that is Mother Nature, for she is the abyss of chaotic balances, the labyrinthine hortus conclusus, reducing the ineffable spirit and form of the pagan Mother Colossus to but the splinter of man's rib was the first proclamation of absolute male autonomy. Mother was nature, but now God is father. This is the fons et origo of Western civilization, the moment at which the transcendence of nature unfolded and the sovereignty of the individual emerged. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. The birth of individuality from the caste conglomerate of the ceaseless environment results from this Freudian drive, this organic urge away from mother cult, the need to transcend and overcome nature. As Jane Harrison tells us, man cannot escape being born of woman, but he will, as soon as he comes to manhood, perform ceremonies of riddance and purgation. Arising from this compulsion, we see that all modes of athletics, philosophy, science, art, and politics were invented by men, for these are his mechanisms of independence. Man, repelled by his dependence on a physical mother, on the cold, voluptuous earth, has finally conjured a new substituted reality, one of his own making, a heterocosm, and its fundamental substrate was the masculine, liberated élan vital. Nobody saw this narrative with such illumination as did Rousseau, for he was the great revivalist of the grand pagan atmosphere, of that mother colossus slain by the advent of man's new Western heterocosm. Rousseau's feminine grandeur and piercing emotional wit catalyzed the enormity of what came to be called late decadent Romanticism, a ceaseless imperative to return back to Mother Nature from the Western long-standing sky cult, from Logos. Rousseau was the ultimate androgyne. He effeminized the Western male anima. He was Castiglione's courtier, without the vigor or gallantry. Always deserting society for the sybaritic earth, Rousseau ran to nature with every drop of his blood impassioned and hysterical. This handling of the living world, this seeing the order of things through undivided lucid feminine sensibility, is the central animating force behind all Romanticism. For Rousseau, the immediate simultaneous analogue to nature was woman, that fallen pagan tutelary of primitive consciousness. His theory of nature is the theory of her all-embracing spirit, of man's complete dependence and subservience to her. Masochistic dominance and submission are thus inherent in Rousseau. Worshipping and capitulating the sum total of mind and body to the pagan earth cult is expressed in his confessions. To fall on my knees before a masterful mistress, to obey her commands, to have to beg for her forgiveness, have been to me the most delicate of pleasures. Sometimes I cried out with emotion, "O nature, O my mother." One of the driving impediments of Rousseau's theory of nature was the blind insistence that nature was good, for there was no fairy queen in French Romantic literature to reveal that nature needed only to blink for all chaos to ensue. Rousseau believed that devoid of mother cult and poisoned by sky cult of logos, aggression, violence, and crime become the norm. Hierarchies for Rousseau are but only social fictions instantiated and normalized by society, for it is society that is criminal, and it is the beneficence of nature that keeps brute impulses at bay. When social controls increase, man's animality ruptures forth. Society, for Rousseau, is the toxic asp whose venomous discharge courses through the beating heart of humanity. Mocking, deriding, and scoring at all this was the Marquis de Sade, a creature of myth, a monster of literary genius and scale. He was the optimum preeminent omen to Rousseau, but the shining saint and jewel to Voltaire. The silence of his presence from the common curriculum shows the bigotry of the humanities departments, for he must be squared in all his monstrous glory, and no course on Western literature is complete without his name. Sade is the ultimate satirizing antipode to Rousseau, for his arrows of wit and ridicule, dipped in the proto-spirits of Darwin, Nietzsche, and Freud, always struck the center of Rousseau's benevolent Madonna. For Sade, violence and sex were the animating principles of the living world, the corrupting forces organically imbued in the psyche of man, not products of society. Rousseau revives the Great Mother, but Sade reinstates her callous temperament. She is for Sade the demoness Lamashtu, the source of man's inbred turpitude. Cruelty is natural, he says in Philosophy in the Bedroom. Cruelty, very far from being a vice, is the first sentiment nature injects in us all. The infant breaks his toy, bites his nurse's breast, strangles his canary long before he is able to reason. Cruelty is stamped in animals, in whom, as I think I have said, nature's laws are more emphatically to be read than in ourselves. Cruelty exists amongst savages, so much nearer to nature than civilized men are. Like Rousseau, Sade is a romantic. He sees nature as a theatrical continuum of impulses, imagination, and pure energy. Sade, coming to terms with the great mother cult, took the elements of Rousseau and only inverted them. Rousseau, following the spirit of Masochs in Venus in Furs, creates a world of female dominance, where fleeing society for the all-embracing arms of the macrocosm renders man pure. Rousseau and Masoch, submitting to the tyranny and cruelty that constitute woman's essence and her beauty, are submitting themselves to nature as the source of goodness in man. On the other hand, Sade takes the themes of Lasios's Les Liaisons Dangereuses to emphasize the corruption of man by nature. For Rousseau, man is accustomed; for Sade, he is congenital. Sade is the Hobbesian spawn who put the scene of approximate darkness back into the bosom of earth cult, of Mother Nature. Fleeing society for the arms of that great colossus leads to the full reign of violence and lust. His 120 Days of Sodom is a blistering attack and ridicule of the Rousseauian romantic narrative and the greatest depiction of genuine nature ever written. Sex, belonging to the baleful sequence of feral earth, gives rise to the pleasure-pain ecstasy that has taken both Sade's and Masoch's names. In 120 Days of Sodom, the prevailing theme is completely saturated by the Sadean Masochian worldview, but synthesized. This sentiment, in common parlance as sadomasochism, is the life force springing forth from the pages of that infamous text. It is the pleasure-pain euphorias that is Mother Nature, that is man, naked of societal forces and pressures. She is death, and she is life. She is both feminine and masculine. Sadomasochism is aggression buffered at one instance and released at another. It thus organically consists of the feminine and the masculine in co-contingent union. This Dionysian-Apollonian spectrum fills Sade's epic, making it whole. The libertines and nobles of his 120 Days of Sodom together form an amalgam of androgyny, of nature in its purest form. The bishop, l'évêque, and D'Orsay renounce their masculinity by being libidinally receptive and having feminized physiques. Thérèse and the rest of the libertine women are female sodomites, having rejected their bodies into abject deformity. They have the male taste for murder, sex, and decay. This androgynous climate engines the pleasure-pain ecstasies that Sade attempts to show only arises from man's innate nature, what Rousseau falsely attributes to society and its mold. Sade is the epitome of bona fide nature, for every path to Rousseau seems to always lead to Sade. These two literary giants mark the polar opposites of the romantic spectrum, but define the movement in its absolute totality. Both used nature, that pagan mastodon, as the norm, but from the same premise arrived at opposite conclusions. For Sade, she was that great Hobbesian Leviathan, with crimson tooth and claw, but for Rousseau, she was that bounteous Madonna, with floret heart and tenor. The sum total of these nature worshippers give rise to all themes, motifs, cliché, and truisms baked into Romanticism, from early to late decadent. Their influence, polarizing but unfluctuating, is patently evident in Baudelaire and Swinburne, Wordsworth and Poe, Blake and Coleridge, and so many others. Rousseau and Sade, made manifest and incarnate, are the Romantic movement, the call back to Dame Natura. Written by Andrushka, and read for you by me, Alan Rickman, this is Romanticism, Rousseau, Sade, and the Resurrection of the Mother Colossus.